My plate hit the floor before I even understood why. The sound wasn't loud, not really, but in a quiet restaurant where people sip wine and speak in lowered voices, it was enough to turn every head in the room toward me. And for a brief second, I thought perhaps it had been an accident, a clumsy server, a slip of the hand, something ordinary, something forgivable. But then I heard her voice, sharp and clear, cutting through the soft music like it had been waiting for that exact moment. Which, you should have never come. And I realized it wasn't an accident at all. It was deliberate, measured, almost rehearsed, and somehow that hurt more than the words themselves, because it meant this had been planned, that I had been invited not as a guest, but as a target, and still, I didn't move, I didn't raise my voice, I didn't even look at her right away. I simply glanced down at the shattered remains of what had been a perfectly arranged dinner, the sauce slowly spreading across the polished floor, the kind of place where a meal costs more than some people's weekly groceries, the kind of place where I had once felt proud to be invited. And I reached for my napkin, folded it carefully, and placed it beside my empty glass as if nothing unusual had happened, because reacting would have given her something, and I wasn't ready to give her anything, not yet. Not in front of strangers who didn't know my name, but were already forming opinions, already deciding who I was based on a single word thrown into the air, and I could feel their eyes, curious, judgmental, uncomfortable, and I let them look, because I had learned something over the years. Silence makes people uneasy. It forces them to fill in the blanks, and most of the time, they get it wrong. But sometimes, just sometimes, they start to wonder if there's more beneath the surface, and I needed that. I needed them to wonder. Because this wasn't the first time Ashley had tried to erase me. It was just the first time she had done it so openly, so publicly. And as I slowly lifted my gaze, I saw Daniel sitting there, my son, my only son, his eyes not meeting mine, his fingers wrapped too tightly around his glass, and that told me everything I needed to know. This dinner, this invitation, this entire evening had been arranged long before I ever walked through those doors. And yet I had come anyway, wearing the navy dress I had saved for special occasions, bringing a small gift I now realized would remain unopened, believing, foolishly perhaps, that family dinner still meant something, that it could still be repaired. But sitting there, with the murmurs rising around me and the weight of that single word hanging in the air, I understood something had shifted, something final. And as I reached into my purse, not for my phone, not for my keys, but for something I had signed that very morning, something Ashley knew nothing about, I felt a calm settle over me, steady and quiet, the kind of calm that doesn't come from acceptance, but from certainty, because for the first time that night, I wasn't reacting anymore. I was remembering. And more importantly, I was ready. Daniel finally looked up, but not at me. His eyes drifted somewhere past my shoulder as if I were already gone, as if erasing me had become easier than acknowledging what had just happened. And that was when I understood that this evening had not been about dinner at all. It had been about positioning, about drawing a line in a place where everyone could see it, and making sure I knew exactly which side I was expected to stand on, or rather, which side I was no longer allowed to stand on. And still, I did not speak, because words would have made it smaller, reduced it to an argument. And this was not an argument. This was something far more calculated, something that had been building quietly over months, maybe longer, in the small spaces between conversations, in the pauses that lasted just a little too long, in the polite smiles that never quite reached Ashley's eyes. I had noticed those things before. I just chose to interpret them as distance, as adjustment, as the natural growing pains of a family changing shape. But sitting there now, with the weight of that moment pressing against my chest, every one of those memories began to rearrange itself, each one clicking into place like pieces of a puzzle I had refused to solve. And suddenly I could see it clearly, the way she had gradually taken control of conversations about the house, how she always redirected discussions about finances, how she would laugh lightly and say things like, "It is just easier if everything is in one place." And I had nodded, trusting that one place still included me, that it still respected what I had built over a lifetime. But now I realized that one place had never been meant for me at all. It had been designed to function without me, to move forward without interruption, without the inconvenience of an older voice asking questions. And as the server approached, hesitant, unsure whether to clean the floor or wait for instructions, I gave a small nod, a silent permission that seemed to relieve him more than it should have, and I watched as he carefully gathered the broken pieces, his movements respectful, almost apologetic, as if he understood that something more than a plate had been shattered. And in that moment, I felt no anger toward Ashley, not the kind that demands immediate reaction. What I felt instead was a quiet clarity, the kind that settles in when the truth finally stops hiding. And I reached into my purse again, this time letting my fingers rest on the edge of the envelope I had placed there earlier that day. The paper was thick, official, the kind that carries weight even before it is opened. And I thought about the morning, about the lawyer's office, about the way the pen had felt steady in my hand as I signed my name without hesitation, not out of spite, not out of fear, but out of recognition that things had already changed, that the version of my family I had been holding onto no longer existed, and that holding onto it any longer would only make this moment harder, not easier. And when I finally stood up, it was not abrupt, not dramatic, just a simple movement, the kind that might go unnoticed in any other setting. But here, in this room where silence had stretched too long, it drew every eye once again. And for the first time since the evening began, I looked directly at Ashley, really looked at her, at the confidence in her posture, the certainty that she had won something tonight, that she had secured her place by pushing me out of it. And I almost understood her, almost admired the precision of it, if not the cruelty. But what she did not see, what she could not possibly know, was that the foundation she believed she was standing on had already shifted, quietly, earlier that day, in a small office across town, with a signature that changed everything. And as I placed enough cash on the table to cover not only my meal but theirs as well, a small courtesy I chose to maintain for myself, not for them, I realized that this was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of something far more decisive. And as I turned and walked toward the exit, the soft glow of the restaurant lights fading behind me, I did not feel smaller. I did not feel dismissed. I felt certain, and certainty, I have learned, is far more powerful than any words spoken in anger. I did not look back when the door closed behind me, not because I was afraid of what I might see, but because I already knew. And there is a certain kind of strength in not needing confirmation, in not chasing after something that has already revealed its true shape. And as I stepped onto the sidewalk, the evening air felt cooler than I expected, sharp enough to wake me fully into the moment. And for a few seconds, I simply stood there, letting the noise of the city settle around me. Cars passing, distant conversations, the ordinary rhythm of life continuing as if nothing had shifted. And in a way, nothing had, except for me, because something inside me had finally aligned with what I had been sensing for months, that quiet unease I could never quite explain, the feeling that I was being slowly moved out of my own life without anyone saying it directly. And I thought about the first time Ashley had suggested that Daniel handle all the financial paperwork, how she had smiled when she said it, light and reasonable, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. And I had agreed, because trusting your own family is not supposed to feel like a risk. It is supposed to feel like safety. But trust, I have learned, can be redirected, reshaped, even used. And once that process begins, it rarely announces itself. It simply continues quietly until one day you find yourself sitting at a table that no longer belongs to you, being told in the most public way possible that your presence is no longer welcome. And yet even then, I did not feel the urge to return inside, to correct them, to demand an apology, because apologies, when forced, are empty. And I had no interest in collecting empty things. What I wanted, what I had already secured, was something far more concrete. And as I began to walk toward my car, parked just a short distance down the street, I reached into my purse once more, this time pulling the envelope out completely, holding it in my hand as I walked, feeling the weight of it, not heavy in the physical sense, but significant, definitive, the kind of document that does not raise its voice yet changes everything it touches. And I remembered the lawyer's expression when I had explained my decision that morning, the slight pause before he nodded, as if he understood more than I had said out loud. And perhaps he did, because people who deal in these matters often recognize patterns long before others are willing to name them. And he had asked me one question, just one, whether I was certain, and I had answered without hesitation, because certainty does not arrive suddenly. It builds, slowly, through moments just like the one I had left behind. Moments where silence speaks louder than words, where absence becomes more telling than presence. And by the time you are asked if you are sure, you already know that the decision was made long ago. You are simply catching up to it. And as I unlocked my car and sat inside, placing the envelope carefully on the passenger seat, I allowed myself a single breath, deep and steady, not to calm down, but to acknowledge what had just ended. Not a relationship exactly, but an illusion. The belief that I still had a place in a structure that had already been redesigned without me. And as I started the engine, I did not feel lost. I did not feel abandoned. I felt prepared. Because while Ashley had chosen a public stage to make her statement, I had chosen a quiet office to make mine. And the difference between those two choices was not just timing, it was outcome. Because one was meant to humiliate, and the other was meant to finalize. And as I pulled out into the street, the lights of the restaurant growing smaller in my rearview mirror, I knew that what came next would not require raised voices or dramatic scenes. It would unfold in documents, in signatures, in the kind of decisions that do not need witnesses to be effective. And for the first time in a long while, I understood exactly where I stood, not at their table, not in their narrative, but firmly in control of my own. The drive home was quieter than usual, not because the roads were empty, but because my mind no longer filled the silence with questions. There was nothing left to question, only things to accept. And as the streetlights passed one by one across the windshield, I found myself remembering the house, not the structure itself, but the years inside it. The mornings when Daniel was still a boy running down the hallway. The afternoons when I would sit at the kitchen table balancing bills and making sure everything stayed afloat. The nights when I believed that building something stable meant it would last, that if you gave enough, if you held everything together long enough, it would become unbreakable. But stability, I have learned, can be mistaken for permanence. And permanence is something no one is guaranteed, not even in a place you paid for, maintained, and protected for decades. And when I pulled into the driveway, I sat there for a moment before turning off the engine, looking at the front door as if seeing it from a distance for the first time, not as a home, but as an asset, something that could be transferred, reassigned, removed from one name, and placed into another. And that shift in perspective did not come with sadness. It came with clarity. Because once something becomes transactional, it can be handled without emotion. And that is exactly what I needed now. Not emotion, but precision. And as I stepped out of the car and walked inside, the familiar scent of the house greeted me, subtle and unchanged. A reminder that while people may alter their intentions, spaces often remain honest. They reflect only what has been placed into them. And for years, I had filled this place with effort, with care, with the quiet work that no one notices until it is gone. And I wondered briefly if Ashley had ever truly understood that, or if she had only seen the end result, the comfort, the security, without recognizing the cost behind it. But understanding was no longer necessary, because what mattered now had already been set into motion. And as I walked into the living room, I placed the envelope on the coffee table, smoothing it out with my hand as if it needed to be perfectly aligned, not for appearance, but for myself, a small act of order in a moment that could have easily felt chaotic. And I sat down across from it, not opening it, not needing to, because I knew every line inside, every clause, every condition. I had read it carefully, more than once, not out of doubt, but out of respect for what it represented. And I thought about the timing, how earlier that day it had felt like a precaution, a step taken just in case things continued in the direction I suspected. And now, only hours later, it had become something else entirely, not a precaution, but a response, not emotional, not reactive, but aligned with reality. And I could almost see the sequence ahead, the moment when Daniel would call, perhaps tomorrow, perhaps the next day, his voice careful, measured, trying to smooth over what had happened, framing it as a misunderstanding, a moment that got out of hand. And I would listen, just as I always had. But this time, I would not adjust myself to fit his version of events. I would not soften the edges to make it easier for him to stand between two sides, because there were no sides anymore. There was only what had been revealed and what had already been decided. And as the clock on the wall ticked steadily forward, I leaned back slightly, allowing the quiet to settle around me, not heavy, not oppressive, but steady, like something that had finally found its balance. And for the first time in a long while, I did not feel like I was waiting for something to change. It already had, and the next steps would not require confrontation. They would require patience, timing, and the kind of calm that does not waver once it has been earned. Because while Ashley had chosen to make her statement in a room full of witnesses, I had chosen to make mine in a place where only one signature was needed. And in the end, that difference would matter far more than any words spoken across a table. The house remained quiet that night, the kind of quiet that does not press against you but instead settles gently, like something that has been waiting for the right moment to return, and I moved through it slowly, not out of hesitation, but with intention, noticing things I had stopped noticing years ago. The way the floor creaked slightly near the staircase, the faint reflection of the hallway light against the picture frames, the small details that once felt ordinary but now carried a different weight, because I was no longer moving through this space as someone trying to hold everything together. I was moving through it as someone preparing to let go of what no longer belonged to me. And that distinction changed everything. It removed the urgency, the need to fix or explain or repair, and replaced it with something far more stable, a quiet sense of direction. And as I returned to the living room, the envelope still resting exactly where I had left it, I sat down again and finally opened it. Not because I needed to reread it, but because there is something final about seeing your own decision in print, something that confirms that what you felt has been translated into action. And I traced the lines with my eyes, each word deliberate, each clause clear. There was no room for misinterpretation, no space for negotiation. Everything had been defined, and that was the point, not to create conflict, but to remove it entirely, because conflict requires two sides, and I had already stepped out of that arrangement. And for a moment, I allowed myself to think about how this would unfold, not in dramatic scenes or raised voices, but in quiet realizations, the kind that arrive when paperwork is reviewed, when expectations meet reality and find that they no longer align. And I could almost picture Ashley's expression, not angry, not even upset at first, but confused, because confusion is often the first response when control slips unexpectedly. And Daniel, he would likely try to understand it logically, to find a reason that made sense within the framework he had been operating under. But what he would eventually see is that this was not sudden, it was not impulsive. It was the result of a series of choices, not just mine, but theirs as well, choices that had gradually shifted the balance until there was nothing left to preserve. And as I folded the document back into its envelope, I realized something else, something that surprised me in its simplicity. I did not feel the need to explain any of this to them. Not tonight, not tomorrow, perhaps not at all, because explanation is often mistaken for closure, but closure does not come from words, it comes from acceptance. And I had already reached that point, long before the restaurant, long before the invitation that was never truly an invitation. And as I stood and walked toward the kitchen, I poured myself a glass of water, the simple act grounding, steady, and I leaned lightly against the counter, looking out at the darkened backyard, a space that had once been filled with noise, with gatherings, with the kind of moments that people later describe as memories worth keeping. And I did not regret those moments, not even now, because they were real when they happened. They served their purpose, but holding on to them beyond their time would only blur the clarity I had now. And clarity, I have learned, is something to protect, not question. And as I set the glass down and turned off the kitchen light, I understood that the next part of this process would not require confrontation or announcement. It would unfold naturally, through systems already in place, through decisions already signed. And when the time came, there would be no need to raise my voice, no need to defend myself, because everything that needed to be said had already been written, quietly, earlier that day, in ink that does not fade and does not ask for permission to be taken seriously. And as I made my way upstairs, the house settling once more into silence, I felt something I had not expected to feel so soon. Not relief exactly, but something close to it, a steady, grounded certainty that whatever came next, I would meet it on my own terms, not as someone being pushed out, but as someone who had already chosen where to stand. Morning arrived without hesitation, the light coming through the curtains exactly as it always had, steady and predictable. And for a moment I lay still, listening to the quiet hum of the house, as if it were confirming that everything was still in place. that nothing had shifted overnight except what I had already decided. And when I finally stood and made my way downstairs, there was no heaviness in my steps, no lingering doubt waiting to catch up with me, only a clear sense of sequence, of what would come next and how it would unfold. And as I prepared my coffee, measuring the grounds the same way I had for years, I noticed how routine can either anchor you or trap you, depending on what you allow it to represent. And today it felt like an anchor, something steady beneath me as everything else repositioned itself. And I carried the cup into the living room, the envelope still resting where I'd left it, unchanged, undisturbed, a quiet reminder that decisions, once made, do not need to be revisited to remain valid. And I sat down beside it, not touching it this time, because I did not need to. The act of signing had already done its work, and instead I reached for my phone, scrolling briefly, not searching for anything specific, just observing the ordinary flow of messages and updates that continued regardless of personal turning points. And then I saw it, a message from Daniel, simple, carefully worded, asking if we could talk. No mention of the night before, no acknowledgement of what had happened, just a request, neutral on the surface but carrying the weight of everything left unsaid. And I did not open it immediately, not out of avoidance, but because timing matters, not just in action, but in response. And I placed the phone back down, letting the message sit there, allowing the space between his words and my answer to exist, because that space was where the balance had shifted, where I was no longer reacting on instinct or obligation, but choosing deliberately. And as I sipped my coffee, I considered what that conversation would sound like, the careful tone he would use, the way he would attempt to smooth the edges without addressing the center, perhaps suggesting that things had been misunderstood, that emotions had run high, that it was not meant to be taken so seriously. And I could almost hear myself, in the past, agreeing, adjusting, accepting a version of events that required me to minimize my own experience in order to maintain peace. But that version of me had already stepped aside, replaced by someone who no longer needed to translate disrespect into something more acceptable. And after a few minutes, I picked up the phone again and opened the message, reading it once, slowly, then setting the phone back down without replying. Not yet, because there was nothing urgent about this. Urgency had belonged to a different dynamic, one where I felt the need to resolve things quickly, to restore what had been disrupted. But now there was nothing to restore, only to acknowledge. And as the morning continued, I moved through the house with the same quiet precision as the night before, straightening small things, opening windows, letting in fresh air, not because it was necessary, but because it felt right, like preparing a space for a new phase rather than holding on to an old one. And at some point, I found myself standing again, in the living room, looking at the envelope without reaching for it, understanding that its significance did not come from being held or opened, but from being enacted. And that part was already in motion, quietly, without announcement, without spectacle, just as I intended. And when my phone vibrated again, another message from Daniel, shorter this time, more direct, I finally allowed myself a small, measured response. Not an explanation, not an invitation to debate, just a simple acknowledgement that we would speak later on my terms. And as I set the phone aside once more, I felt no tension, no anticipation, only a steady awareness that whatever he said, whatever he asked, it would not change what had already been set into place. Because while words can attempt to reshape a moment, they cannot undo a decision that has already been made with clarity. And that difference, I knew, would define everything that came next. By late afternoon, the house had settled into a kind of stillness that no longer felt empty but intentional, as if every object understood its place in a way I was only now beginning to fully appreciate. And I found myself sitting at the dining table, the same one that had hosted countless meals, conversations, and quiet compromises. Yet today it felt different, not because it had changed, but because I had. And when the clock reached the time I had decided on earlier, I picked up the phone and dialed Daniel's number, not with hesitation, but with a calm certainty that surprised even me. And when he answered, his voice carried that familiar blend of concern and caution, as if he were stepping carefully across something fragile, asking how I was, whether we could talk about what had happened. And I listened without interrupting, allowing him to lay out his version of the situation. The way he described it as a misunderstanding, a moment that had escalated unexpectedly, something that could be resolved if we all just took a step back and approached it with patience. And for a brief moment, I recognized the pattern, the way he positioned himself between two sides, trying to maintain balance by softening the edges of what had been said, what had been done. But this time, I did not step into that space with him. I remained where I was, grounded in what I had seen, what I had heard, what had been made unmistakably clear. And when I finally spoke, my voice was steady, not raised, not sharp, simply direct, and I told him that I understood his perspective, that I knew he wanted things to return to normal, but that normal had already shifted, that what happened was not something that could be adjusted or reframed into something smaller, because it revealed something larger, something that could not be unseen once it had been shown so openly. And there was a pause on the other end of the line, longer than any before it, as if he were searching for the right words to bring the conversation back to familiar ground. But I continued before he could, not out of urgency, but out of clarity, explaining that I had already taken steps, practical steps, not emotional ones, and that those steps were not meant to punish or provoke, but to align my circumstances with the reality I now understood. And I could hear the shift in his breathing, the subtle change that comes when someone realizes that a conversation is no longer about resolving a moment, but about accepting a decision. And he asked what I meant, carefully, almost cautiously, and I told him that I had reviewed everything, the house, the arrangements, the assumptions that had quietly formed over time, and that I had made changes, not out of anger, but out of responsibility to myself. And there was another pause, this one heavier, filled with the weight of implications he was only beginning to grasp. And he asked if this was really necessary, if there was not another way to handle things, something less final. And I considered his question, not because I doubted my decision, but because I wanted to answer it honestly. And I told him that sometimes the most measured response is the one that does not leave room for interpretation, that clarity, once reached, requires action that reflects it, not delays that attempt to soften it. And as I spoke, I realized that there was no tension in my words, no need to convince him, only a need to state what was already true. And when he finally responded, his voice quieter now, he said he needed time to understand, to process everything. And I told him that was fair, that understanding often comes after acceptance, not before. And as the conversation came to a close, there were no raised voices, no dramatic endings, just a quiet acknowledgement that things had changed in a way that could not be undone. And when I set the phone down, I did not feel relief or regret, only a steady sense of alignment, as if the distance between what I knew and what I had done had finally closed, leaving no space for doubt to return. The following day unfolded with a quiet sense of inevitability, as if the pieces that had been set into motion were now aligning without the need for further effort. And I moved through the morning with the same steady rhythm, aware that while nothing outwardly dramatic was occurring, something far more significant was taking shape beneath the surface. And around mid-morning, the doorbell rang, a sound that felt almost unfamiliar in its timing, not unexpected, but purposeful. And when I opened the door, Daniel stood there, his posture more reserved than usual, his expression carrying the weight of someone who had spent the night reconsidering more than just a conversation. And for a moment we simply looked at each other, not in conflict, but in recognition of a shift that neither of us could ignore. And I stepped aside to let him in, not out of obligation, but because this moment had been anticipated, and it deserved to unfold without unnecessary resistance. And as he entered, his eyes moved briefly around the room, as if searching for something that had changed, though nothing visible had. And we sat across from each other, the same positions we had taken many times before, yet the space between us now held a different kind of clarity. And he began by saying he had thought about everything I had said, that he understood I was serious, that this was not just a reaction to a single moment. And I listened, allowing him to continue, noting the way his words were more measured, less defensive, as if he were no longer trying to reshape the narrative, but to understand it as it stood. And he asked about the changes I mentioned, not directly questioning them, but seeking to comprehend their scope. And I explained calmly, without detail that would invite debate, that I had adjusted the ownership structure of the house, that legal documentation had already been reviewed and signed, ensuring that the property would no longer be subject to assumptions or expectations that had not been explicitly agreed upon. And I watched as that information settled with him, not as a shock, but as a realization, something that confirmed what he had begun to suspect. And he asked if this meant that he and Ashley would need to make other arrangements in the future, and I answered honestly that it meant the house was no longer something they could consider as theirs by default, that any future decisions would be based on clear terms, not unspoken understandings, and there was a silence that followed, not tense, but reflective, and in that silence, I could see him processing not just the practical implications, but the deeper meaning behind them. The recognition that a boundary had been drawn not out of anger, but out of necessity. And after a moment, he nodded, slowly, as if accepting something that could not be negotiated. And he said that Ashley had not expected things to go this far, that she believed it would pass, that things would return to how they were. And I responded simply that expectations do not determine outcomes, actions do. And that once something is revealed, it cannot be returned to a state of being unknown. And he did not argue with that. He did not attempt to defend her words from that evening, because there was nothing left to reinterpret. And as the conversation continued, it shifted from explanation to acknowledgement, from questioning to acceptance. And by the time he stood to leave, there was a quiet understanding between us, not one of agreement, but of clarity. And as I walked him to the door, I realized that this was not an ending, but a redefinition, one that would shape every interaction moving forward. And when the door closed behind him, the house felt exactly as it had before, steady, unchanged in its structure, yet entirely different in what it represented, no longer a place held together by silent assumptions, but one defined by deliberate choices. And as I returned to the living room, the envelope no longer felt like a turning point, because that moment had already passed. What remained now was the outcome, quietly taking its place, exactly as intended. In the days that followed, nothing outwardly dramatic occurred, and yet everything had changed in a way that could not be reversed, not through apology, not through time, not through any attempt to return to what once felt familiar. And I moved through each morning with a quiet awareness that the life I had built was no longer something to be shared by default, but something to be respected by design. And that distinction, subtle as it may seem, altered the way I carried myself, the way I spoke, the way I allowed others to enter my space. And a few days later, Daniel called again, his tone different this time, not cautious or uncertain, but grounded, as if he had finally reached a place where he could speak without trying to shape the outcome. And he told me that he had spoken with Ashley, that they had discussed everything, not just the incident, but the patterns that had led to it, the assumptions they had made, the way they had both allowed a sense of entitlement to form without ever questioning it. And as I listened, I did not interrupt, not because I was holding back, but because there was nothing left that needed correction, only acknowledgement. And he said that Ashley understood now, that she had not fully realized the weight of her words in that moment, that what she saw as frustration had crossed into something else entirely, something that could not be dismissed or minimized. And I noted the way he phrased it, not as an excuse, but as an admission. And that difference mattered, not because it erased what had happened, but because it indicated a shift in awareness. And he continued, saying that they were making plans to move, not immediately, but with intention, that they would no longer rely on the house as something permanent, that they would build something of their own, on their own terms, without the assumptions that had complicated everything. And I let that settle before responding, not with approval, not with resistance, but with a simple acknowledgement that it was a responsible decision. And as the conversation continued, there was no attempt to return things to how they were, no suggestion that everything could simply be repaired with time, only a mutual understanding that what had been exposed had required a different kind of response, one that prioritized clarity over comfort. And when the call ended, I placed the phone down and looked around the room once more, not searching for confirmation, but recognizing it, the quiet steadiness of a space that no longer carried unspoken expectations. And later that afternoon, as I sat by the window watching the light shift across the yard, I found myself reflecting not on the moment that had started all of this, but on what had followed, the decisions made in silence, the conversations held without raised voices, the boundaries set without the need for confrontation. and I realized that strength does not always announce itself in the moment of conflict. Sometimes it reveals itself in what comes after, in the ability to remain composed, to act with precision, to allow actions to carry meaning where words might fail. And as the sun lowered, casting long shadows across the lawn, I felt no need to revisit what had been said that night, no need to replay it or reinterpret it, because its purpose had already been fulfilled. It had revealed what needed to be seen, and in doing so, it had allowed everything else to be placed exactly where it belonged. And as I stood to close the curtains, I understood something with a clarity that felt both new and long overdue. That respect is not something that can be requested or negotiated. It is something that must be reflected in the way others choose to act. And when it is not, the response is not to argue or persuade, but to adjust, to realign, to ensure that what you have built is protected not by expectation, but by intention. And in that understanding, there was no bitterness, no lingering resentment, only a quiet, unwavering sense of resolution, the kind that does not demand recognition because it does not depend on it. It simply exists, steady and complete, exactly as it should.